It does give me enormous pleasure to welcome Marina Wheeler here.
Thank you, Susanna. I'm going to throw this away. Sorry.
Marina, as you know, is a barrister specialising in constitutional and human rights law, and her father was one of my heroes, the distinguished journalist at the BBC, Charles Wheeler. But we're here to talk about her mother, Deep Singh, and indeed her Sikh family, and the whole trauma that they went through because of partition. Because this is a book which is about loss, it's about new beginnings, it's both a personal book and also a very political book, because I, for one, learnt more about partition than I ever thought I was going to be able to. It's not nearly as simple as one was taught at school. And so there's a lot to talk about. But Marina, first of all, what was it that prompted you to write this book? Why did the thought come?
The thought came, I guess it was 2017, the anniversary of Indian independence and partition. And you may remember there was quite a lot of commemoration, a lot of television programs at that time. And it just suddenly struck me then that there was this seismic event, one of the most significant events of the 20th century that my mother had lived through. And we'd hardly talked about it. She didn't especially want to speak about it, and I hadn't really asked. So I think that hit me square on. But I can't really claim credit for then just settling down and writing it. I think the book was sort of teased out of me in a way, probably by a few people. There was, I don't know if you ever saw a film by Gurinder Chadha, then Viceroy's House, and she was a Punjabi origin young woman too, and so she made this film Viceroy's House, and I was asked to review it. So I did that. We may come to the historical thesis of that film, which is slightly curious, but so I was quite interested writing about that, and I asked my mum about it, and then publisher Rupert read the article and said, "What about a book?" But even then, I still needed a bit more prodding, and that was my daughter who said, sorry, this is probably a slightly longer answer than you wanted, but I thought I would like to write this book. I would like to spend time with my mother. This is a fantastic chance to hear her story. But I was just slightly sort of undecided until my daughter said, stop faffing around, or it will be too late. And she was completely right since.
But what's interesting about it is that it is both personal, and we'll come on to your family, but also deeply political. And you mentioned that film because even then, that provoked, Fatima Bhutto, for instance, absolutely was outraged by that film. Yeah. And so all the tension is still there, isn't it?
Well, I was so interested in that. I mean, I didn't think the film was... I liked lots of things about the film, and I can't actually, to be honest, see the audience very well. So I don't know whether any of you have seen it or how you reacted to it, but I thought it was mixed. I thought in some ways it was wonderful and, colourful, and it's great to be tackling these events. But the historical thing was odd. It was quite sort of, I think, faithful to the history for a bit. And then it goes off on this, with this thesis that Britain secretly had a plan, Churchill's plan, even though he was out of office then, to partition India in order to retain access to oil and in order to keep Karachi away from the Russians. So, but that's one indication, I think, of how contested the history is. But I think you mentioned Fatima Bhutto, and I think her response was she thought it was very anti-Pakistan. And, this was unfortunate because Gurinder Chadha's response was, well, I was trying to promote reconciliation. And as I say, I think she was trying to do that, but it's just such a minefield. And I think what I was interested in partly was what that told me about history as well, and told me about how incredibly difficult it is to tackle these subjects still now.
Yes, and for your family, it was a very personal history. So even though there might have been plots, and even though you had people like Jinnah and Gandhi and all these big players, on a personal level, there was your family, your grandfather and your grandmother in Papaji and in Punjab, living this extraordinary life of luxury, with a huge house and your mother off to school and the orchards to play in and all these things, the narcissi in the garden, all these wonderful, wonderful memories, and seemingly at the time almost oblivious to the fact that actually it was all about to implode.
I think I was interested in going back and I suppose sort of teasing that out of her, because I mean, one thing I mentioned that we'd hardly spoken about this, and I think I've discovered since that, you know, she wasn't unusual in that most families that lived through partition, Indian, I mean, obviously I mainly know of Indian ones, but since travelling to Pakistan, I think also on that side too, you know, they haven't wanted to talk about it. And so it's just been sort of buried and put to one side. So with my mother's, I started talking to her first. Yes, it was these idyllic images that you've touched on. You know, this extraordinary garden and house and the flowers and a canal going through the garden and early morning walks with her father and so on. But as you say, oblivious until suddenly, you know, the Muslim neighbours that they had lived side by side with for so many years. And I think what was so interesting about my grandfather as well was that, I mean, he was I don't know what phrase, kind of a big cheese in the neighbourhood, in the district. But as were, you know, they called them the gentry, Muslim gentry, Hindus. He was a Sikh. So they all really were the kind of governing class in a way together, with a few Brits who would turn up sort of every now and then from Lahore. But this sort of sense then that I got, that my mother did talk about how her father, that was his, you know, that was how he lived. He was sort of a stalwart of the Raj. But her siblings were absolutely not. And they were very whipped up by the whole independence movement and, of course, you know, the sort of excitement of Congress and Gandhi. And so I think, you know, she did have this sense before partition that something was changing. But, I mean, none of them predicted the you know, cataclysm that it was
Well, they all
going to
thought
be.
they were going back, didn't they?
They did, yeah. I mean, and as I've discovered since, you know, many hundreds of thousands of families, I think same thing of just, you know, shut the house, lock the door, give the key to, you know, either the neighbours or one of the retainers they had, and expect to go back. And I think my mum's own family, again, like many, they hardly took anything with them. I mean, they took a couple of sort of pots and so on.
Yes, food, it seems to have been.
Food.
Your grandmother cooked and took it all, but left all the money and the jewels and everything and the carpets and all the valuable things were left behind.
But I think that was because my grandfather refused to believe that it wasn't going to be possible to live side by side with Muslim brothers, as he called them, you know, once Pakistan was created. And I certainly don't think that was the intention, that there should be such a firm border. But, yeah, as we know, that's how it turned out.
And what intrigued me too was, for me anyway, a discovery about the Sikhs as a people, a group of people who are relatively small in number, but enormously powerful, very well educated, who operate all of those important positions within the community, and yet were excluded from the political debate. The political debate became about Muslim versus Hindu, with the Sikhs somehow squeezed in the middle.
I mean, that is true, and I'm going to be a bit cautious here because I'm very clear in writing the book that I'm not a historian, and I'm sort of doing my best. And I did read a lot, but I'm doing my best to try and sort of tease out, I suppose, you know, what happened both from historical accounts and also my family's story. And I think the Sikhs were in an appalling situation because, once it was decided that there was going to be partition, so once it was decided that Pakistan, however one wants to put it, Pakistan was going to be created, or the British acceded to the demand for Pakistan, then you ended up in this position where the Muslim and Hindu Sikh populations, a border had to be drawn. So where were you going to do that? And if we're just talking about the Punjab, because I only really deal with the Punjab and not Bengal, but it was possible to work out where, roughly speaking, not without some difficulties, but Muslim majority areas were, by and large. But the problem for Sikhs is they would just disperse throughout the whole of the Punjab, and it was the birthplace of Sikhism, so there were gurdwaras all over. So it was once that decision had been taken, and as you say, the Sikhs were just a small population, and I think one has to remember as well with this that there was such pressure. I think Britain wanted a solution to this. India wanted to be independent. I mean, perfectly understandably. So some solution had to be found, and it is the Sikhs. The Sikhs lost out in a big way. But it's quite hard, and I'm quite interested in this as well. It's quite hard to see any other way. That they could have, I suppose, had a better outcome, really.
It's a fascinating book because it is about your teasing out exploration of that particular history, but also the history of your mother, whom you get to know in a sort of slightly different way as a result of this, don't you? That actually there's a whole side of her personality which emerges. And there's a moment quite early on when she's in Delhi where there is a sense of possibility now, suddenly, that there wasn't before, that it wasn't, that being in Delhi gave her opportunities she wouldn't have had before.
Yeah, and I think, again, that's what I found quite intriguing, which was that, this, as I called it, seismic, cataclysmic event of partition with, up to 1 million killed, 10 million people displaced, although that's also Bengal. For my mother, I mean, it was an event that opened up her life. And she did, before the sort of real opening and marrying my father, who obviously I'm, very pro since he's my father, but she did have an arranged marriage before. And that was a sort of, I suppose that was part of the impact of partition, which was that they left Sargodha, they left what became Pakistan, and were lucky enough to have somewhere to go in Delhi, because her older sister had been married into a family that was settled there. So she was then married to the younger brother, married into that same family, age 17, since they didn't have anywhere to live. And I think her parents thought this was, they were securing her future.
Well, because having left everything behind and I'm going to ask you to read a bit from the book in the middle in a moment, but having left everything behind, of course, they weren't nearly as rich as they were before. So marrying a rich member of Delhi society was presumably securing everybody's future as well.
Yeah,
anyway, it
absolutely.
Didn't work.
It didn't
marriage
work.
Didn't work out. And Deep decides to leave, which is a pretty revolutionary thing to do at the time. So here is the description.
Okay, this is just a short little snippet we've agreed that I'm going to read. The only preface I'll give you is just that because she didn't like talking, this was a taboo subject in our family. Some of what I write is pieced together from what others have said. So this is just a tiny snippet. Deep pauses at the top of the stairs, steeling herself. In one hand, she holds a small, square suitcase, hand luggage Air India used to give its customers in more prosperous times. The other hand grips the mahogany banister as she takes the first step down. She glides past portraits, coats of arms, and her 6-year-old nephew, Tejbir, who's standing in the hall below. Tejbir watches her descent. He expects her to pause, but she doesn't. She continues towards the door and she's gone. He doesn't know what's happening, but he can sense it's something momentous. Other family members are nearby, but nobody speaks. In those days, the mid-1950s, in that place and social milieu, wives didn't generally walk out. She hadn't been beaten, and her in-laws were kind, but Deep wanted something different from life. We were supposed to be married, she says, but we had nothing in common.
And off she goes. And she takes herself off, away from Delhi, off to Mumbai or Bombay, and starts again doing any number of very random jobs, I have to say. She was obviously quite a character, your mother.
I think so. And sort of the funny thing is I wouldn't have thought of her or didn't think of her as a character. I mean, obviously she had incredible character to walk out. And I guess also sort of, I suppose just a sort of really strong sense of self, to be able to see that this, you know, this future that had been mapped out for her wasn't for her. But I think, you know, I didn't really realise that growing up. I think, you know, we tend to sort of find it hard to look at our parents probably as children. But part of what I think I enjoyed about writing this as well was sort of getting that perspective on her, and sort of seeing her more as a three-dimensional human being.
Well, a rounded human being, and at this particular stage, a girl who managed to get, because she was still a girl, managed to get herself a job at the Canadian High Commission and all sorts of rather glamorous. She was obviously, she was very beautiful.
She was, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Which must have helped.
I'm sure it did help, yeah.
Well, you know, because...
Well, yeah, I mean, it definitely helped. And I mean, one of the things that I stumbled across as well in writing the book is this incredible film footage when she was at the High Commission, as you mentioned, Susanna. There was she was asked to interpret for a Canadian film crew that came over from Canada to do a documentary about Canadian aid to India. And so she goes off with the Canadian film crew, and I think he's quite a well-known journalist at the time, and she interprets and so on. And then afterwards, they decide, and she gets a letter, which she kept and showed me, from the producer saying, you know, we finished doing the film, and we've put it all together, and you're so amazing and dazzling that I thought of doing another film all around you. But we didn't, and anyway, it's screened. And I had never seen it before, but for writing the book managed to get hold of it, and watched it. And it is extraordinary how, you know, she's there as the interpreter, but there's quite a lot of shots where basically it's kind of around her. And again, it was this sort of moment of, oh my goodness, you know, she's just extraordinary, and she's extraordinary on the screen. And yeah, my dad was the television journalist, but she so easily, you know, could have held her own doing that.
And it makes it all the more extraordinary that she doesn't talk about things. She doesn't. She keeps so much inside her. Well, we'll read a bit later on about going to the Tower of London to see the Koh-i-Noor. But even after she, you know, she was a woman who was not afraid to walk away. Yeah. So when she met your father and married him, she left India almost without a backward glance, didn't she?
I mean, I think the plan, she said the plan was that they would go back every year. And, you know, I think one of the sort of oddities and mysteries for me growing up was the fact that she went back so little. She went back 3 times in total after they left. Gosh. I mean, we used to go without her, but she sort of declared after 1973, no, she wasn't going to go. I mean, she did develop claustrophobia and didn't like flying, but there was an occasion she flew to Russia with my father on an interesting kind of trip. So, you know, she could do it. So there was more to it than that. And I, you know, I mean, that is part of, I suppose, what I'm exploring in the book as well, is this, as I say, slight mystery about how she felt about India and why she didn't, why she kind of kept us a bit away from it, and we had to sort of press to go.
And did you work out what that was?
I think so. I mean, I think although she'd always referred to herself as twice displaced, I have to say again, slightly ashamed that I didn't really explore that much with her. But I think the whole leaving India, I think I didn't appreciate that that was as hard as it turned out to be. I think I was surprised towards the end of her life when she referred to India as home. She talked about homesick, and I sort of did a double take of, in what sense is this home? But I think it was the fact that I think she herself found it hard to cope with having too much of India in her life. So I think she slightly kept us away, and she never taught us Indian languages, my sister or I. And I think that was really about her. She used to, my cousins remonstrated with her about that, and she said, I didn't want to confuse them and so on. But I think it was about her sadness of leaving, and I think it was also about sadness about the fact that her relationship with her father, although never recovered from her leaving the marriage.
No. That was really clear, that actually he
didn't forgive her.
But he didn't forgive her at all, did he?
No.
No. And he was a man, it's so interesting because you get the feeling that he was a huge success when he lived in the Punjab. And there's a phrase in the book where everything he touched in the Punjab turned to gold, but everything when he was working out of Delhi turned to dust. And in the photographs that you have, he sort of is diminished, isn't he?
I think so, and I think that was, my mum felt that was the case. I mean, he'd, as I said, been this, big cheese in the Punjab, and although I don't think he was, materialistic in the sense that, he had a great deal and they lost it, and then when they lived in Delhi, they were still very privileged. They were lucky to have a roof over their heads and so on. And the governments did organise compensation. So they got some money and were able to build a much, much more modest house. He also got some land in Hoshiarpur in what they called evacuee property. So it was some land that a Muslim family had abandoned when they had to flee to what became Pakistan. And so my grandfather used to he never sort of took to the city, and he would just take himself off to this bit of land, and he'd go in the bus. And, my mum's siblings would say, oh, why don't you, take the car and so on. And he'd say no, or they'd say, oh, go first class. And he just felt happiest there, really, sort of tending to mango trees and so on. So I think, and again, as I say, that irony of, his life was never the same, but my mother's was sort of enhanced
yes. But one of the things I also found fascinating in the book is about you, actually, and about, it's fine because you talk about teasing stuff out, but actually it's such a voyage of self-discovery for you as well, isn't it?
Well, it is, yes. I think in all sorts of ways. I think I'm sort of honest about the fact that I'm starting off in terms of sort of Indian history from a very low position of knowledge of pretty much the Gandhi film was about, the Gandhi film was about, as far as I got, the very sort of, stock accounts of the sort of big players and so on. So obviously that was fascinating. It was fascinating to be able to, again, I suppose, talk to some of my Indian family, and I have, a lot of Indian family still, cousins and nieces and nephews still there in Mumbai and Delhi, and talk to them in a way that I hadn't talked to them before, because obviously we've been to lots of weddings and so on, but to sort of settle down and talk to them a bit about the past and history, and some of the cousins as well, who hadn't been back to Sargodha or the Punjab, and the fact that I could go and they couldn't really go because now you can't get visas. Indian citizens find it very hard to get visas. So I was very lucky to be able to take that journey.
Yes, and you did take that journey. In a way, part of me thought it was about, gosh, one should never go back. There's a photograph that you say you couldn't send your mother because it didn't look the same anymore as it had when they'd left. So, I mean, but you did go back and you found out an awful lot about new Pakistan and the way it's evolved since partition.
I did, and I mean, you're right to say or to touch on that the fact that I didn't. There was photos I couldn't send my mother, and that was also an interesting bit, which was that she, when I first said to her, I mean, obviously she knew I was writing the book, and you know, she sat down and over many conversations, of course, we talked about various bits and pieces, and as you know, because you've read the book, there were points where she didn't want to talk, and so she had her ways of avoiding that. But when I first said I was going to go to Sargodha and look for her house, I mean, she said, well, why would you want to do that? And was very sort of nonplussed about the idea. But I think then she didn't oppose it, she sort of let me go. But I did think it was really, I was doing it more for myself, I sort of realized, because she, you know, she was 85 when we were having these conversations. As I said, I realized, you know, it had been painful in many ways for her. But she had, through the burying and various other techniques, she'd kind of reached a point where, you know, she'd sort of put it away. So I think that's when I felt, or why I felt when I was there, and I was, you know, I was struck by how, I don't know, in a way sort of airbrushed out so much of the presence of the Sikh and the Hindu population, and everything my mother's life had been, and her father's sort of achievements and so on, was sort of, on the face of it, kind of gone. So I thought, well, really, am I going to communicate this to my mother at this stage in her life? So maybe there was a bit of sugarcoating.
Yes. There's a lovely photograph, actually, of your grandfather at the opening of a hospital for women, where he's standing there surrounded by various Englishmen and various other people, all looking suitably formal and pompous. And there he is, not looking pompous at all, actually, in the middle of the back row, looking rather splendid. And you were able to give a copy of that photograph to the hospital, which is still there. And that must have been enormously pleasing, really, to be able to do that, to restore him to his place.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I think that was the whole sort of experience around what they called the female hospital of Sargodha was very wonderful and moving, in that it was basically that photograph, which is in the book, really the only sort of, almost the only document that I had when I started out from the family. And I had this photo, and as you say, it is an incredible it's an incredible snapshot of the Punjab in the 30s, because it has the governor, the British governor, as you say, his number two, who was my grandfather sort of called a friend, the deputy commissioner. And then it's got the sort of the big Muslim family of the district, the Tivana family. And they're there in the, shouldn't move too much. They have these really flamboyant turbans on.
They do.
And then there's my grandfather, the Sikh, and then there's a Hindu lawyer there, and that's about it. And my grandfather's there, as I say, he's a doctor, and he's also the president of the municipal committee, so that's why he's there. But then, of course, partition comes, and, you know, they're all dispersed, and the Brits go back home, and the Hindu and Sikh have to flee, and the Tivanas too, also interestingly, sort of represent a completely different era. They represent, you know, I mean, it was quite a feudal society then, and I talked about the gentry and so on. And they're not really part of this sort of concept of Pakistan. They're not part of the Muslim League. They're quite, you know, what they call cross-communal. So the important thing, I think, in that society was sort of landowners and non-landowners, not really a division on religion. I'm slightly straying from the point about the picture, but anyway, so this photograph, I have this, and I do manage to find, with some help, the female hospital, which is wonderful. And then I think, that was a moment of my feeling that I was wondering, they didn't know at the hospital anything about the origins, when had it been built? I mean, obviously a bigger hospital had kind of developed around it. But to be able to say, well, actually, here's this photograph, and it would be great if you could put it up on the wall. And then to find that they did was a tremendous thing.
There's a sort of general ignorance or airbrushing, and you come across a particular professor who has this total sort of revisionist view of everything that went on. It was extraordinary, and it's a real, sign of the dangers of, misinterpreting and the need to go back and dig up what really happened, because otherwise history gets lost. And he was most old man, wasn't he?
He was a very old man. I mean, he is now deceased, sadly. So I am still defaming him. But no, I mean, that was completely fascinating, because I went to the University of Sargodha. I was given a contact there, and there was a young academic called Abra, who features in the book, a young academic whose specialist subject, it turned out, was colonial history. And he welcomed me. He was the one that tracked down all sorts of things, including the sort of female hospital and so on. And he brought lots of his colleagues to talk to me, and he wanted me to talk to his students, which I did, and that was all fascinating. But then he also handed me one day this book and said, I think you'd be interested in this, which was the book by the professor about Sargodha. And he said it is very Pakistan movement. And I didn't really at that stage understand what that meant, but I sort of took it and so on. And then he arranged for me to talk to this professor as well. And yes, and I think the fact that it was such a selective history, I mean, it was seen completely through the prism of, as they say, Victor's history, in the sense that the Tivanas were absolutely the lowest of the low, because they hadn't promoted Pakistan. And talking to him, and then I asked him about what he'd said in the book as well, was there was no violence here in Sargodha. And I was sort of quite surprised about that. And so I discussed this with him, and I said, well, why was it that all the Sikhs and the Hindus leave? And there wasn't much of an answer about that. Anyway, I do explore in the book our discussions together. But what was so interesting was that the younger academics, who I guess had exposure to, all sorts of scholarship from around the world, and who just were interested in, in delving. They were interested in talking to me, and we had fascinating discussions. But there was a sort of tolerance of the fact that this official history that had been written and the university had signed up to really didn't bear that much relation to reality.
And what then of India now? Because, it is very much a Hindu country now, under the present government. And do you see echoes of the old arguments between Jinnah, Nehru, Gandhi re-emerging now?
Well, I think what I have been interested in, also in discovering, that was also talking to my younger relatives, is the way in which, yes, I think this history that my mother knew, and she referred to Nehru and Gandhi as her pin-ups. And I think their whole philosophy, the secular philosophy of India, which is, of course, what India was based on, that we can all live together equally, that's being, dramatically eroded. And I think that, I think there was a point at which the sort of new regime, there was a tolerance for that. But I think it's difficult now. I think it's got to the point where, I think there's such hostility to the Muslim minority population. It's very hard to ignore that now. And it's just exacerbated the tragic hostility between India and Pakistan, that division which, as we know, because Jinnah had his house in Mumbai, which I go and visit, and there was a bit like, my grandfather closing the door and giving the key, not taking anything with him. Jinnah obviously felt that he would be in Mumbai. He was, before partition, early days, a barrister there in what was then Bombay. But obviously their idea was that there would be a sort of fluid movement between the borders, which of course tragically didn't.
And there still isn't. It's difficult, as you say, the Indians can't go. One of the things that intrigued me, and it'll be interesting to know, I suspect many of you will have been to India as tourists in recent years, and I certainly have, is the fact that what you mostly go and see is the Mughal Empire, the Muslims. It's a celebration of something which then actually went horribly sour, however many hundreds of years later. But those are the things you go and explore as a tourist now, even in contemporary India. It's odd, isn't it? And the Red Fort, Humayun's tomb,
absolutely,
all these wonderful places are all celebrations of the Muslim history.
That was Humayun's tomb. I think had a sort of particular poignancy for me, but absolutely, that's one of the great sort of destinations in Delhi, isn't it? But I didn't know that in the immediate aftermath of partition, when all of these hundreds and thousands of refugees were flooding into Delhi, of Hindus and Sikhs from the Punjab, and Muslims in Delhi were being persecuted, slaughtered by, in part, the arriving refugees because, they'd seen their kinsmen being slaughtered, and there was just a sort of... Anyway, so many of those Delhi Muslims took refuge, of course, in Humayun's tomb and, slept in those stone corridors and so on. And then many years later, sort of again, I suppose this was a sort of partly why I found it so fascinating, was sort of the way, the great sort of movement of history. My mum told me that, those sort of heady days when she worked at the Canadian Embassy, that sort of glamorous period of her life, she used to go with her young friends and they would dance up on Humayun's tomb, with a sort of wind-up record player, tangoing and so on. And so it was quite extraordinary to go back and see that.
Quite extraordinary. Well, I'm going to ask you to read one more bit because you go with her to the Tower of London, and what's fascinating is she doesn't talk about India and she doesn't express, the fact that this is her homeland, albeit, as you call it, the book, the lost homeland, the lost homestead. And yet, there's a moment when she lets you know very firmly. So it's Okay, so this is I think I'm about 7 or 8 here, so we were still living in America and have come to England for a trip to see my English grandparents, and we go to see the Crown Jewels. Yes, I say sometimes during our summer breaks we visited London. Once this involved a trip to the Tower. I could list the US presidents in all 52 states, plus their capitals, but had a shaky grasp of English history. Still, I was excited to see the Crown Jewels. It was a popular attraction. The queue was long, but we moved forward steadily. As we approached the exhibits, Deep leant in to examine the purple velvet and platinum jewel-encrusted crown. A large gem in the middle caught the light. To my horror, Deep raised her head, pointed, and exclaimed, "They stole that from us. It's ours." From a shadowy corner of the room, a uniformed steward glided towards us.
Move along now, he drawled smoothly. The crowd was supposed to be in constant motion, filing deferentially past the display. So what was my mother thinking? What was this embarrassing woman on about? Who stole what, when? I agreed with the steward. We had to get her out, fast. I now know what she was on about. For centuries, the Kohinoor diamond was the Indian subcontinent's most valuable and sought-after jewel. When the East India Company annexed the Punjab in 1849, the young Maharaja Duleep Singh was forced to hand over the Kohinoor to Queen Victoria. And here it is, in the Queen Mother's crown. Just stop there.
One of the things, the last question, because I will come to the audience now, is that you know, this 8-year-old, would she have described herself as an Anglo-Indian in the way that you do now? Or has this become something that's developed as you started? Have you sort of embraced your Indian history more recently than you did before?
Well, gosh, that's a big question. I mean, I have embraced it more. I know a lot more about my mother's roots. I know a lot more about India and about Pakistan. I'm still not an expert, but I definitely know a lot more. And yeah, I've thought about it a great deal. But I kind of think, in a way, that I've sort of reached a position where I think I'm less keen, on dividing up my identity as sort of British and Indian. I think I'm much more moved, maybe this is also, I suppose, getting older and so on, but moved into a point where I think I just sort of see identity as quite fluid, and my own as well. And, you know, I mean, I'm obviously much more Western educated. I have quite a Western outlook, liberal sort of, outlook, I think. But I've, through the book as well, come to know a lot more about the Indian diaspora here, and that's quite a fascinating thing. But I think that also means that I think I'm just looking much more at a sort of, a blended identity that also changes over time. I don't know if that answers your question.
It does,
at all.
because actually it's part of the joy of the book, really, is whether you meant it to be or not, is actually the evolution of you and your understanding of, everything that went on, and how these people and these things are actually also part of your DNA. And that becomes clear as you go through the history. It's fascinating. Good. Anyway, it's a lovely book.
Thank you.
I recommend
I'm
it
glad
to you.
enjoyed it.
So, time for questions. We've got 15 minutes, so if we can have the lights up a bit. And I dare say there will be people wandering around.
Gosh, there are people here.
Yes, no, full house. Look, there they all are. So somebody somewhere must be wandering around with a microphone. So the first question is a man down here in the second row. So if you can bring the microphone down here.
You can tell from my accent what I'm going to ask you. But I was fascinated about your mother's connection with the Canadian High Commission. Did she establish any long-term contact with people she worked with at the High Commission?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, she did keep this letter that I referred to, the letter from the producer. She kept it in a sort of little paper bag from the Royal Academy. I can just sort of picture it in her drawer. And I wish I could remember his name, and indeed the journalist's name. But I don't think, and the letter said, she had contact, he'd written and said, as I said, you were wonderful and so on. And I think there must have been a previous letter where she was testing the water of maybe getting a job. And he said, come to Canada. There's not a specific job, but, you'd be amazing and we'd love to have you and so on. But she never, that was never acted on. And the reason it wasn't acted on was because, as I say in the book, she showed my father this letter. They were, as they called it, courting at that point. And my father said, well, what about me? And that basically was, she said, well, what about you? And he said, they got married then after that. So the whole sort of, I suppose, Canada connection is a bit what could have been, but didn't happen. But she definitely, nurtured a real love for Canada. And I think, we lived in the US for a long time, but Canada had something that, maybe she felt was a bit softer.
Well, all those charming Canadians who write very schmoozy letters, obviously.
Right, yeah.
Yes, inviting them to stay. Absolutely. Yeah. Yes. Do we have another question from the audience? I'm sure some of you've got some questions. No, well, yes.
Is the photograph of the front cover, is that your family?
Yes. Okay, I'm going to hold up the photograph. Oh, is it? Oh, so it is. Okay, well, I better look to see. Okay, so my mother is on the far...
The beauty at the end.
Left. Then her sister Amajit, who's the one that married the older sister, who was married into the family that then my mum was married into, but left. Then my father's in the middle there. Anoop, the sister who was in Mumbai. Then Anoop's son, Rajbir, so my cousin. Then the front row, another cousin of mine. Then Papaji, my grandfather, so the sort of, big player in the book. Me sitting on his knee looking like a little boy. Haircut age 4. Another cousin. Then another cousin. And then my grandmother is sitting, is also seated. And on her lap is my sister, kind of looking cheery. By the side. So this is one of the few trips back to India. So I said my mother went 3 times after she married. And this was in 68 with us. And then down the side, actually, there's a little bit of, pattern, is from her wedding sari. So I'm actually wearing a bit of one of her old saris too. But this was the design from the sari she wore when she married my father. So we decided we'd stick that on the cover of the book.
And she carried on wearing saris quite a lot too, didn't she?
She wore saris, all through her life for whenever she went out of the house. Well, actually, then for sort of formal, so when she went to work, and she didn't work when we were young kids, but after we went to university, she began working for Amnesty International when we were my parents were living in Sussex. So she used to travel on the train and then on the buses and, hoisting up these incredible sort of dazzling silk saris. But it was absolutely a sort of, a kind of cardinal rule in a way. And when I was talking to her about that, when I was writing the book, she said, yes, saris were very important to me. I felt, it was a sort of reminder of where I came from.
And that's the interesting thing, having only going back 3 times, having walked out, left it all behind, but still, essentially, she was a very beautiful Indian woman, and those saris were important. She never lost that, did she? She
didn't lose that, but, I talked to her about, and I mentioned how much was she willing to have India in her life. And one thing she never did is she never sort of read books about India. And of course, I'm sure lots of you will have read A Suitable Boy, because you're obviously keen readers, given that you're here. What a wonderful book, Vikram Seth novel. She wouldn't read it. And, I asked her about that, and she just said it just felt too close to home. And, she didn't use the word raw, but in a way, that's what she was describing, and yet that was decades after she'd left India.
So she absolutely bottled it all up until... So how did she feel then when you were there, bringing back all this information about what you'd found and what you'd uncovered and what you'd seen? Obviously not the bits that you didn't send her and tell her about, But the things you did discover, how did she respond to all of that?
Well, I mean, actually, I think my whole approach in talking to her and in reporting back to her was quite low-key. I mean, I think I was, as I said, very aware that she'd sort of found this equilibrium. So I think when I was asking her questions, you know, I was very careful not to be sort of, I don't know, hectoring or, you know, sound like I was cross-examining her or anything like that. But equally, I think I did sort of, I mean, I often kind of contained my excitement and enthusiasm and kind of gave her quite a sort of, I think quite a sort of slightly toned down version of what was going on. But I mean, you know, she read the book. She didn't actually read the very end, the Pakistan part. I mean, sadly, she died at the beginning of last year, but she read all the you know, the rest of it and about her childhood and so on. And I mean, and that was interesting too. So she also, I think, encouraged me because there were bits, as I said, that she didn't really want to talk about. And so I wasn't able to sort of, in a rigid way, sort of report what she'd said. But she said to me, you know, feel free to use a bit of poetic license. And hence, you know, like that bit that I read out at the beginning about her leaving. I mean, I know she went down that way because I was then taken by my cousins to see this house that I'd never seen before, and look at the coats of arms and so on. It's since become, what was it? It was something quite strange. I'm trying to remember. It was a cultural centre, and I can't remember for which country now. But anyway, so I was able to see it. But that was at the invitation of my mother. It was sort of that's how we're going to do it, is that I give you kind of, I give you so much, but I also give you permission to fill in a bit where I don't want to be explicit.
And you say at the very beginning that your daughter encouraged you to write it because, you know, otherwise it'll be too late. And as you say, your mother died last year. So I bet you're jolly glad you did do it.
I am jolly glad that I did do it, yeah. No, my daughter sort of feels a bit smug now, of course. I'm sort of like, you know, I told you so sort of thing. But yeah, no, she absolutely had the right instinct, which was that, you know, I mean, I'm sure, and I think having done it and talked a bit about it since, I know there's lots of people who, you know, so many people know their parents have these amazing stories. I mean, sure, sort of lots of you, but life being what it is, you don't get the chance to sit down and do that. So, you know, a combination of factors meant that I was able to do it. And yeah, so I am very pleased that I did do it.
Well, I'm very pleased too, because as I say, it's a wonderful book. Ladies and gentlemen, Marina Wheeler, thank you.
Thank you so much, Susanna. Thank you.